So good morning, Sarika, and welcome back to the recording of our second podcast. I know that it's been quite a bit to get here, and we've both dealt with quite a few things this morning. So shall we just take a few moments of grace just to ground ourselves and to get into the room fully?
Absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. Let's do that. Oh, thank you for that. I want to start by saying I find a slight constriction in my chest as I was trying to breathe in there, and reminding myself as I did that anxiety is under-oxygenated excitement, to paraphrase Wells. Yeah.
Never heard that before.
Yeah.
It actually makes so much sense if I listen to that.
Yeah. And as I tap into that, I'm just noticing, I think it's that excitement, right? That of this podcast, of the recording, of this topic. But what I haven't shared with you in our chit chat just before this is actually it's a very significant day to be recording. And I'm not sure if you remember because I said it when we set the date aside, but today is the day I became a mom 8 years ago. It's Mika's birthday.
Congratulations. Oh, wow. What a special day.
Yeah. And so this morning when I had good intentions to journal, but I didn't, as I said to you, because life started happening around me. I was just reminded of, just what that felt like, actually giving birth, being there, the excitement, the anticipation. And then as I moved forward from that, because I thought, wow, becoming a mom is kind of what ultimately led to my research topic, and my research topic is what ultimately led to us launching and forming the MotherHood. And then, of course, recording this podcast. So, yeah, what came up for me is on so many different levels, it feels like the celebration of birth. So that's kind of how I'm entering our podcast today.
That's absolutely beautiful. So congratulations to your son and congratulations to you. I know that it has been a journey full of many, 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 many blessings. And it's very amount of challenges that has resulted in you being the woman that you are today. And may he continue to just bring light and love into your life the way he has in the last 8 years.
Thank you.
So talking about your research, I think the last time we met, we recorded, we spoke about how we met and what brought us together. And I recall then already we picked up that your research, as you've mentioned, was a significant part of getting us to transition from the dream of working in this area to actually moving us into action. And that research, then we said we will come back and talk about more. And here we are today. So the specific research that you did was a part of, if I recall correctly, your MPhil studies in inclusive innovation. The topic of your dissertation is quite a mouthful. And instead of me getting it wrong and fumbling over my words, I'm going to ask you to maybe share the topic with us and also then take us on the journey of where it started. How did you decide to focus your research on this particular topic?
Look, Rensha, I'm going to be honest, handing the baton over to me. I don't know that it's going to help with the pronunciation, even as a first language English speaker. And that's one of the challenges of academia. So I'm going to give it a shot. But I think So the ultimate topic from a very formal perspective was it was around experiences of modern day motherhood and work, an interpretative phenomenological study of professional working mothers, self-care and coping. So that in itself, I think, deserves an award.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, look, it's a mouthful, but I think in summary, it really is around modern day motherhood, um, with that very sort of, I'm going to say, the lens of coping and self-care. So yeah, to your point around how I got there, and I know you and I have spoken through this many times, but I often start by saying it's not a pretty story because something possessed me to sign up for a master's program when my son was a year old. And you know, they say hindsight and all of that. And I think back and I go, what was I thinking? And I think part of me was thinking like, no, I mean, it can't be that hard. Like, I mean, you know, and while he's young, rather, and he doesn't need me so much, you know, all of these lovely thoughts and ideas. But I guess the difficulty around it is something that I think we can all relate to in our own way. So firstly, this isn't, you know, I call it no ordinary masters. I think the MPhils in particular have something really special about them. And this one around inclusive innovation was really, in my experience, a transformative program. And I remember them saying to us in the very first session, you know, don't be too precious about your topic because it's likely that it is going to change. And I've gone in to this MPhil in inclusive innovation at the UCT's graduate school with the intention to focus on the skills needed for the future world of work based on the UN report and the skills needed. I think back then it was for 2020, right? And then one night into my second module, I found myself slouched against the kitchen cupboard on the floor, crying to my husband, saying, I just don't feel like I'm coping. You know, I had ideas or thoughts of, you know, could it be postnatal depression? Like, why am I feeling this way? And I think that's when I decided to change my topic because it really piqued a curiosity in me around what happens to women when they become mothers, but particularly working mothers. And even as I say that term, and you know this, it creates so much dissonance and almost anger in me because we don't talk about working fathers, right? And yet it's a term that most people relate to, you know, when we talk about working mothers. And I think just to clarify where my intention and my heart sits on this is that, you know, all mothers work, all fathers work. It's unpaid work, you know, it's unpaid labor in the home. And I think for the purposes of our discussion here, when we refer to working mothers, it's really women who are working outside the home in paid labor. So yeah, I think I just want to refer to my notes, Rachel, because I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Okay, I think that's
as you do, Sarika, I think that's right. That when and it's becoming more visceral for me when I hear that term. I actually do have a physical reaction, and so what triggers me is going, so you're implying that some moms don't work if you're referring to working moms. And I love the differentiation that you're bringing us in when we talk about it. It's that the mothers that choose to also hold a professional paid career alongside their role of motherhood that we then specifically focus on, not implying that the others aren't busy with meaningful and important and strenuous work.
yeah.
The other part of the other role does not encompass that. So just, yeah, I think, and as we're defining what the research was about, those of us that have done academic research would know that one of the requirements for research is that it needs to be quite narrow and focused. And so in yours, I recall seeing that you specifically then focused on this professional working mothers, and you added another layer in there of having one child under the age of 6 months. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Any particular reason for choosing that?
So yeah, I think definitely, as you know, academic research does require you to remain quite focused, just so that you can get through kind of, you know, the group that you're looking at. Otherwise, you know, your research could take years. in terms of the requirements that you need to fulfill. So I think the narrow focus is also around homogeneity, so that, there's opportunity for comparisons, pardon me, noticing trends and things like that as well. So I think just the context going into that is inclusive innovation is around social entrepreneurship, and social entrepreneurship is around solving relevant issues together with the people that it impacts the most, with a deliberate focus on not for profit. Profit may come, but it sort of comes afterwards. So I think I could have chosen to do my research on mothers who were domestic workers, as an example. And we all know that as a group itself is such a vulnerable group in South Africa, as moms, and the challenges around childcare, etc. But I remember reading a paper that was part of my required reading by Professor Warren Nelson, who was one of the sort of founders of the program, or early founders of the program. And he spoke about social entrepreneurship from the inside out. And the way I interpreted what he'd written was working where we had influence and impact, not about handouts, going out there to do the work. It's about, so what and where around me do I have impact and influence, and can I work? So I think that's kind of what got me around professional working moms, working in corporate, because that's where I work. And then I think in terms of some of those other criteria, I think being first-time moms, because I think first time is the most significant transition. There's no manual, they don't come with anything. And then I think just based on my own experience, my greatest challenges started to emerge once I'd integrated back into work. And so again, most moms take anywhere between, we're fortunate in South Africa, 3, 4, up to 6 months. Some people, if they're really lucky, a year. So I wanted to catch those moms who'd gotten back into work. So both those roles and identities around motherhood and being a professional working person were in demand at the same time. That was that point that really caught my attention. And then I think that focus on coping and self-care was honest, to be honest, was what I was struggling with. Like, I was just not finding the time. I couldn't sleep when my kids slept. People say sleep when the child sleeps. It doesn't work. So yeah, that's a kind of how I came to that nice narrow focus. And then I think just sticking with sort of all of the elements of academic research, I think at this point I just want to say something more around the context and applicability of the study and our conversations. I think, very strictly speaking, from a purely academic perspective, as what we call a qualitative study, so not focusing on large numbers, but focusing rather on depth. The particular methodology I used is what we call not transferable, i.e. we can't make generalizations as a result of the research. And at the same time, I think, as we've spoken many times and had events and spoken to other moms, we inherently know this to be true, so there is anecdotal evidence and support for it. I think the second one is that, mothers are collective, and we, as much as we have things in common, there are also uniquenesses around our context. There's no one right way to parent or mom, to be a mother. And there's definitely no such thing in my mind as a good mother or a bad mother. I think we're all really just doing our best under the circumstances that we find ourselves in, our personal and our sort of more social collective circumstances. I think the third point is really around, again, my research focused on professional working moms, but whether it's the retail shop assistant or the petrol attendant or the factory worker or the person supporting with home care, I think, you get the point. We're all mums. We all have different contexts. And so the challenges that moms in those contexts face, some of them might be similar and some of them might be, quite different and unique. And then I think the second last point is really around heterosexual and same-sex partnerships. And I think the experiences of motherhood there might also differ. So my study, as you know, focused on heterosexual partnerships based on the group that I got. But I remember one of the things as I was researching for my work was coming across research saying that in same-sex partnerships, there weren't engendered roles. And so those conversations needed to be had, so I think that experience might be different. And I think the last point is something we often neglect, and that's a real big shout out to the fathers. I think men, fathers, they're part of the system. They're as much find themselves impacted as part of the system that we find ourselves in. And I think, it's really a partnership and an opportunity for us to unlearn and relearn together.
Yes, Sarika. You're so right. Again, something else I'm so conscious of, that we're speaking from this perspective of us as working moms and our challenges and our frustrations and the things that we're seeing and experiencing aren't working, and we're not implying that they're at fault. They're caught in the same dynamic with us. And yeah, I think some of the solutions in itself that might look like a solution from our side could create more strain and frustration on their end. And therefore, I think whatever we explore here, it's lovely to know that it's not professing to be the be all and end all. It's purely just actually giving ourselves a safe space to be able to acknowledge the challenges and start to think about what could potential solutions be, but not undervaluing those that are impacted by it or are part of the solution and they're
Yeah. I want to throw something in here because I don't know that I'll get to it later. And I think it's something important that came out in my research is allowing fathers to take the responsibility and the accountability. And I think as moms, we also have some work to do there, because
yes.
And again, I think it's engendered and it's the expectations, internal and external, around how we show up. So yeah, I think we must remember that as we move through. Yeah.
Sure. And if we don't get to this today, I know we will in future podcasts definitely explore more. So I think before I start kind of asking you specifics about your research, there's one thing that stood out for me as I read your research paper, and that was an exercise that you started all your interviews with. And if I recall correctly, you asked the moms to draw a picture of how they saw themselves coping. And what I was, and so again, my mind was filled with ideas of why you could possibly do that. And I'll ask you to speak into that in a minute. But one of the things that struck me was how some of them reflected of how therapeutic that experience in itself was for them. It seemed initially like an icebreaker, and yet it seemed like something so much more. I think the one actually even said it felt like something of awareness that broke open in her, which I thought was such a beautiful way of expressing it. Tell us maybe about what was your intention behind the exercise and that you started with.
Yeah, so I smile even as you say it, because I remember one person specifically saying, this feels like therapy, and yeah, so I think as a facilitator in my day job, I want to say in my career, I often need to design workshops, and I think one of the challenges in running a workshop is you've got limited time and you need to almost quite quickly help your clients, often groups of people that you're working with, kind of drop into the challenge, whatever their challenge of their, the circumstances are that they're facing. And I really enjoy trying to get them out of their heads around it. Because, I think it was Einstein who said, you something along the lines of, you can't solve a problem with the same kind of level of thinking or energy, as I like to think of it, that kind of it's created from. And so one of the things I often do is I get them to do something, I want to say left-brained, sorry, right-brained, it's the opposite way around, but I mean, not, non-dominant, non-thinking, to shift their perspective. So I think that was the intention. The intention was to kind of slow down and shift perspective. And I think doing it in a way like drawing, which is not something, unless you're somebody who takes up drawing, and artistry, is not something we do often. So I think that's kind of where it came from, is the opportunity to allow us quite quickly to drop out of our heads and kind of into a sort of a space of energetic availability and flow, and shift in perspective.
Sure, thank you. That's as I'm listening to you, there are many thoughts around that comes up, but I'll hold myself from going into that because wanting us to step perhaps into more of the detail of your research. So we've spoken about coping and care and your personal motivation for going there, and now also having lived that experience, I know that transition into motherhood, which is again something we'll get into of matrices, is traumatic. It's a significant transition. And so a lot of those experiences that I read about the moms testifying of and that you and I have shared about definitely resonates with me if I look back at my own understanding of my own experience. I'm curious to hear, maybe just from a coping and self-care point of view, how did you, prior to the research and obviously as they grow, how did you define that? What does that look like? Because these are words that we use so flippantly every day. And I think some of them, especially self-care, might have attached some stigmas to it. To go self-care massages and having my hair done. Or what is in self-care the way you've looked at it?
Yeah. So I think my opening line to that is often it's not manis and pedis that we're talking about necessarily. And it could be. I mean, you and I had a little kind of casual chat before this, around, you're saying, oh, Sarika, you're looking good. And I was like, I wash my hair, and kind of saying like, sometimes when I feel like in that space where things just aren't going, I'm feeling a bit down. There is something about just washing my hair, whether I wash it myself or I have it washed and done, that just kind of feeds me in some way. So it's not necessarily that kind of stuff, but as we went into the research, what women broadly defined as self-care was tending to their own needs. And as you know, there's one of the diagrams in the research that shows the invisible hierarchy, is what I've named it, around how the child kind of becomes, top, front, and center of everything. And then there's family and work, and that wasn't entirely clear around an ordering, but literally women, we put ourselves literally at the end, at the base, we pick up the crumbs in terms of our time, in terms of our energy availability. We don't prioritize ourselves and our needs. So I think self-care very broadly was around attending and tending to our needs. And then I think the other thing that came out was that could be physical, whether it's exercise, diet, taking care of our physical appearance, and then there was the emotional and mental side of things. It was connection with our friends, it was a connection with ourselves, our higher purpose, so I think there was that other element to it as well. And I grouped it together as mental and emotional. And then the same applied to coping, interestingly. So coping, the way it came up in terms of the research, because initially I thought, well, you're coping or you're not coping. But as these women shared, it tended to be more of a continuum. And in fact, I adjusted my model at the end to kind of go, so it's not, both the one end might be coping and not coping, but there were many points around that continuum. And you were never just in one place. It was something that really ebbed and flowed, and you didn't always go from not coping to coping. You could move quite fluidly between that. And I think how they defined coping was around managing the needs and expectations of their different roles. And in this particular instance, those primary roles being the role of mother and the role of employee. And of course, there were lots of other things in their partner, being a child to their parents, etc. So yeah, so I think that's around the how coping kind of then emerged. And also with coping, there was physical coping and there was mental and emotional.
In terms of the main themes that came out from the research, do you mind sharing a little bit of that with us?
Yeah, yeah. So I think I'm just recognizing the last time we had the thing up on the screen, so and we don't this time, and I realized I hadn't prepped myself for that. But I think, I think that of all the themes that came up, the one that came up and stood out the most for me was really around the identity struggle. And that was definitely not one that I was expecting. Um, and the reason I wasn't expecting that, Rensha, was all of the people that I'd interviewed had planned, to become moms and planned to have a child. And I think what they weren't ready for is this absolute kind of shift, you know, in who they were around how it impacted on their identity, how they saw themselves. And I think one of the big things I talk about there is how the mother identity kind of becomes front and center and almost envelopes, you know, I'm tempted to use the word engulfs, you know, the the other parts of ourselves, whether it's the partner role or the employee role. It's like it links back to that triangle, where we put the child right at the top. And so that mother identity really becomes, that overarching thing. I think some of the other themes were really around the shift, between or what we call matrescence. So basically, that kind of absolute thing from not being a mom to being a mom. And as we've discussed before, that's really, really a term that I don't think is common for us. We know about adolescence, we know also about menopause, for us as women. But I think matrescence, which Dr. Alexandra Sachs, who was a psychiatrist, kind of, I want to say resurfaced the term that had come up way before, I think, from an anthropologist, if I'm not mistaken, is really around the transition to motherhood and what happens during that period, just like adolescence. There's hormonal changes, there's social changes, their identity changes, their role changes. And I think what Dr. Sachs had found, as you know, was there were lots of people coming to her as a psychiatrist saying, I think I'm struggling with postnatal depression. And, she went through the assessment and find out like, well, no, you're not, you're okay. And these women were finding it really hard to accept that. And I think that's what piqued Dr. Sachs' interest in taking this further and understanding what matrescence was and all the elements around it. So I think that was one. I think the other thing was really around life being like a mad rush, with women just, like jumping from one thing to the other, literally going go, go, go the whole time. And not really having an opportunity, to slow down or to pause. It's one of the things we do at the start. And then at the end is our reflection. I think it's trying to build that into our time. And then I think the two others, one of the main ones was really around, the challenges that women face, and these come from things like unrealistic expectations and impossible ideals. So whether it's media, whether it's internal, because there is a lot of that's internally, right? And in psychology and the Gestalt world, we talk about introjects, when we take things whole from the outside world, and we make it part of what our belief system is. And, even this idea of, am I a good mother? And, I often use that example of, the bake sale.
Mhm.
And being the mom who makes the cookies at home versus the mom who buys it at Woolies or Checkers or wherever. And so I think there's something around these impossible ideals that exist and these unrealistic expectations that exist both within us and the outside of us. And then I think related to self-care and coping, there's this thing of almost it's quite unattainable. You know, we kind of try, we keep trying, and then we keep falling off the wagon, you know. Um, and it's not from lack of trying. There's something around the availability of our time and our energy that we struggle with in terms of maintaining our self-care. So I think without having the model physically in front of me, those are the highlights of all of the different points. Yeah.
Now, something as I'm listening to you, the first time it's landing with me in this way, is I'm suddenly struck by how bizarre it is that for 9 months, as we have these children growing inside of us, and there's nothing we're physically doing to let that growth happen. Yes, we obviously take care that we live a healthy lifestyle and we eat certain things, or if we don't, our bodies will reject that and tell us you weren't supposed to be eating that. But we're not doing anything. We're being, and we're part of this experience. And as soon as we give birth, we take on this immense pressure to go, now I've got to do it, and I've got to try, and I've got to be. And we exhaust ourselves. That gets us into that state that I admit I'm still sometimes living in it. We talk about the mad rush. I'm like, yeah, I'm still there. And it's just this contrast of actually realizing it's not up to me. There's nothing I can do to make this child grow healthier or better inside of me. And yet, when we see them physically, we forget that wisdom, that it isn't all up to us, and we take that on. So that when you're saying we're internalizing certain expectations and the job description that we find ourselves signing up for isn't realistic. Yeah, I think there's also for me a realization there's a part of us that I need to own. I've written it in some ways. I haven't only just signed up to it, but there's a big part of it that's written in my own handwriting. And so that maybe is a way to transition me to go. And so I think it's so, I always find it refreshing to hear it's not just me. If I listen to the stories of your research participants, they make me feel so normal. And some of them had certain things that were easier or that were harder, but at a core level, I'm not the only one struggling. And then I got to ask myself, and how do we do better? How do we learn from our own experiences? How do we change things so that everyone else doesn't have to go through the same despair and the same level of discomfort that we did? So when you look towards potential learnings or solutions, do you mind sharing a little bit around that for us? Our awareness itself is great, but it can't be enough. We do.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I just want to pick up on your reflection first. And I think, one of the things around that first theme, which was the matrescence, the shock to the system, was ambivalence. In addition to the identity struggle, is that ambivalence that we feel, around like really loving our kids, wanting to be there, supporting them. And at some point, it's shifting to like, oh my God, like, oh, and I think what we're fed societally, even with our friends, it's everything, like when people talk about having a child, it's all sort of so warm and cuddly and like a little baby. And yes, we talked about duality earlier. Yes, there's that. It absolutely is. And there are hard things like breastfeeding is not natural to everybody. Most moms I know that I spoke to struggled with it. And then, we have to put our kids on bottle and then we judge ourselves for it. And, so there's this, there is this ambivalence that's unexpected because we're kind of primed to focus on all the positive, we use this word Mika called kushli, which is kind of a made up word from German, I guess. But, like fluffy, cute, warm kind of stuff and not the hard stuff. So I just wanted to hold that, as you commented. So I think I think I like to start with the conclusions of the study. And even as I say this, I'm like, my God, there's like, I mean, it's a good couple of, all close to 100 some odd pages that there's so much there to discuss. And somehow every time we speak, I feel like we're only just skimming the surface, you
Mm.
know. And so as I notice that rise in me, I kind of go, it's okay, Sarika, you have lots of episodes ahead, and we can focus on specific things in specific episodes. So with that, I'm going to go forth and say the conclusions of the study. Um, on the one hand, seem almost obvious, things we know, not rocket science, as I often say, but suggested that that is what it is. They're true anyways. And I think the first thing is around expecting the unexpected. So I think,
Mhm.
again, that's tied back to that theme of it being a shock to the system, and women not being prepared um, for the realities of motherhood
Mm.
and that ambivalence that they experience. And when I say expecting the unexpected, I think there are many different ways that we need to shift this, or we could shift this. I think the first is just starting to be open, honest conversations with ourselves, with our partners, um, with our employers, within our network of friends, of other women. Um, and I think just generally as a society, I think it starts there. You've got to start with small steps. And I think that's, probably the starting point. I think that there are other elements to it around society, and if you think of the diaper ad, or if you think of um, the vapor rub, ad, or whatever, it's always the mom, it's always the mom, it's always the mom, doing this care and kind. And, I think I'd like to see more adverts and things on social media that are a bit more realistic around the hardships,
Mm.
because they are there. And I think we'll start to feel like it's not just me, like you were saying. And we'd start to, the word normalize has been thrown around a lot these days. And we need to normalize that becoming a mom is not all smooth sailing. It is challenging, and you're okay. There's nothing wrong with you if you feel like it's hard. So that's probably the first one. The second one is around what I call leveling the playing fields, and giving moms their lives back. One that I feel very, very passionately around. And I think this one's a little bit of like a woman's lib kind of flavor to it. So I think we've come a really long way. One of the books that I read as I was doing the research was by Ali Hochschild, um, called The Second Shift, if I'm not mistaken. And it really talks about how women, and this was already done in the 90s, would come home from work and then, take on their second shift, which is the house care, the home care, the child care, after having worked already. Um, and I think it's really important because she refers to something called the store revolution. And what it refers to is how women have progressed into the space that were previously predominantly male owned, which is workspace, going out for paid work. But the reverse hasn't happened,
Mm.
not to the same degree. Our male counterparts, on a very broad, general speaking level, haven't taken on as much within the home and the childcare space. And again, this is a generalization. That shout out to men. I mean, I know some of us have amazing partners, um, but again, they're part of the same system, right? So I think that's the second one is really leveling that playing field. And I think when we start to do that, and if we have real egalitarian relationships as far as that's concerned, I think it starts to become easier. And even as I speak, Rachel, all these examples from the research are
Mm.
jumping out at me around how one woman's husband did I don't know, the Argus or Iron Man or something when the kid was like a couple months old. And she's like, yeah, I'm sure you can go ahead and do it. And, not necessarily understanding what you're signing up for in terms of how much you need to put into it, So that's what I talk about around leveling the playing field. I think the third one is around educating mothers on the benefits of self-care, and helping us with practical guidelines and support. So one example I think of is at the US elections. I saw that there was childcare being offered, free childcare, at polling stations, or if you were going to poll. I mean, like, wow, right? So things like that. I mean, there's in South Africa, I keep talking about mommy massage. I don't know that they still, keep that same kind of ethos that they started off with, was, you go for a massage, and again, there's childcare available, so you can have your massage whilst your child is being cared for. And I think without a penalty of almost having to pay additional money for that as well, right? So I think that's an important thing. And I think when I say helping educate women, I think sometimes we don't make the connection because we don't slow down. We don't make the connection around, if I just took that time. Because even when we go for the mani-pedi, we're rushing, we're not there mentally. Our mind's like, okay, I need to be out of here because I need to pick up so and so, and I need to drop off. And then there's supper, and there's that, I'm going to put dinner, and it's that mental work, right? And we often talk about the mental load.
Good.
And I think we need to take responsibility to start to shift some of our own behavior patterns. So that's the third one. And the last one is really around mobilizing support. And I think I really want to expand on this one further, because I think, when we think about support from a psychology perspective, as you know, there's self-support. And I think for us as women, as mothers, we need to think about it in terms of the physical, emotional, mental, and I include spiritual, right? I often use the acronym PEMS to talk about it. And I think when I talk spiritual, some people might see that as connection to God. And that's great, if you're religious. And I think for those who are not, it's just that connection to something that's purpose. That's something that maybe it's your higher self, maybe it's your purpose in life. It's that you, that deep sense of you. So I think that there's that element. And then I think, kind of again, there's a model, and hopefully when we do the edits, we can get it put up, whilst we're having this conversation. But that next layer is our partners, our employers and colleagues, and then our childcare support. So whether that's people that we hire into our homes, like nannies and home care people or pairs, or whether it's taking our kid to creche or play school or whatever. I think it's really starting to look at that and going, how do we shift in those systems? So I feel like I'm saying a lot here, Rensha, so just jump in if you've got stuff to add. But Mika started at a new school, as you know, recently, and one of the things that the school does, I don't know how often, but I know they do it, is they have a day where they extend the school day, or you can take your kids and you bring them back and you leave them there for the evening for a couple of hours, and the parents go on a date. I'm like, that's real support, from an education system. I think of if your kid's late at school, and some schools got to fill out a form and they're late and they've got to wear this uniform. They got to. It's not stress for the kids; it's stress for us as parents, and to be a little more flexible and to understand that sometimes, things happen, and I think it's just an expansion and a releasing of that regimented how things need to be, and an opening, in that space. And then the last circle around that is for me that broader one around other mothers, society, and professionals, and particularly professionals in the research. Women talked about medical professionals in terms of doctors, therapists, etc., coaches, but I think just broadly, how do we shift in those spaces? How do we create more support in those spaces? I think as other mothers, just being more open and honest, and the spaces we're starting to create, where women can come in and feel like they're not alone, and speak to one another and respect our differences. Awesome that you wanted to bake, Rensha. I so admire and appreciate that. Tell me more about how you make that happen. How do you make it possible? As opposed to, and you've heard me speak about this, as opposed to come from it with this envy and mom shaming and, and kind of really pulling us apart as opposed to banding us together. Um, and then I think with professionals, and you've also heard me speak about this, particularly around medical professionals, and I feel very strongly around this. Mental health and well-being has become such an important topic for us, sort of COVID, post-COVID, in all realms. And I really still do feel a little bit like Alexandra Sachs spoke around is, we're putting labels on women and problematizing things too easily. And that's not to say that we don't have people that really have diagnosable mental issues who need to be on meds or whatever. But, motherhood is not it's not an illness. The challenges we face are common. It's okay. It's the system we're in that makes it impossible to be this way. Our forebears were at home with the kids. We're now out working and trying to be at home with the kids. We're doing a double job, and then we still try and hold it all together, And then I think just lastly, from a societal one, in this example, you often share back that resonates to you is when simple things like, you go to the shopping center and there's the little parking lot that shows the mom pushing the pram. Grates my cheese, all sorts, because I'm like, or the bathroom that's available, the changing station always used to be in the women's bathroom, and now we've got family bathroom. So we're making progress, but it's slow. And it's slow. And I think, really challenging, and I know we'll talk more about this in another one, but I think challenging those things. So I feel like I've said a lot.
I just love your abundant sharing, and watching you and listening to you, I can see that one of the things I heard from you is you're living your research, and you live it in many ways. And so, what I'm seeing today is how it is pouring out of you so naturally, because it is not something that you hold in your head, it's something that you're holding in your heart. So I loved every minute of listening to you, and I know there's so much more. And so you reflected on this earlier, or you mentioned it, that I think our idea of continuing with picking up themes in the research that came out of your research and deep diving into it in future podcasts definitely feels like the way to go. Because yes, there's much that I wanted to contribute on each topic, and we will get a chance to do that. I think as we transition out towards closing today's recording, I just want to create some space to perhaps reflect on what we've heard. And I'm sure for me, there's much that I've heard before, but that have landed for me in a different way. And I want to also invite the listeners to take a few minutes with us and just do what we've heard you say, is just actually slow down, take a deep breath, reflect. And once we've taken a few minutes to reflect, I want us to maybe both lead in sharing what we're taking from today's conversation. That's all.
Oh, thanks, Rensha. I'm going to take a moment to think, so I'm going to be quiet for a moment, right? I think my invitation to the people, the other moms and hopefully dads, professionals, whoever else listening and watching this conversation, is maybe to press pause right now and take a moment to think about what's that one kind of affirmation, almost the one thing, if you were coaching yourself, you were your best friend, or whoever it is that you turn to for support, like almost a little bit of a mantra that, you'd say to yourself in relation to this thing called motherhood or parenting, you know. Either what just feels right for you based on your circumstances or something that came up through this conversation. And that could be something like, I'm not alone, or we're in this together, you know. Yeah, and I think the one that came up for me was one that really I hold very dearly, because I really struggle with this mental kind of construct that I hold around not coping. Even despite my research, the lived experience is still there. And I remember in our one online session, as I was in those inspired moments where I kind of go on a bit, I said something along the lines of, we're not broken. There's nothing wrong with us. And I remember one of our audience members latched onto that. So that would be my one, Rensha. I'm curious, what would be yours? What's your reflection, and is there something?
So absolutely, mine isn't also new to me, but it arrived for me in a new way. So me, I love looking at words, and so today I heard you reference the word support specifically, and it hit me because I always consciously use the word support instead of help. And I think when I actually applied that to myself, I was also reminded of your words to go, sometimes we need to allow others to help. So even when it comes to my own self-care, I try to arrange the work around me so that I have time for self-care. And if my plans doesn't work out, my husband often tries to help. I perceive it as help and I reject the help, because if I perceive it as help, it feels like I'm helpless. I need the help. I'm not strong. And so if I can consciously reframe those as asking for support, which does not mean I'm broken. It does not mean there's anything wrong with me. It doesn't mean I'm weak. I'm simply accepting support if it's offered to me, or asking for support, which is a legitimate, in the face of this unrealistic expectations, then maybe I can get myself to accept the support, and I can get out of this heavy load that I often find myself overwhelmed by. So that's mine for today. I'm signing up to accept support and not reject help, which is exactly the same thing. It just depends on how I perceive it.
Yeah. That really, as you say, really resonates for me. And I think thank you for sharing so openly about your personal circumstance, because I think so many of us, my challenge with that is that, I tell myself that my partner doesn't do it to my standards, and that's something I need to ease out, right? So, but I'm as I say that, I'm aware of time, and that maybe we have another episode purely on accepting support. I think we could speak for an hour just on that. So
absolutely,
yeah. But I think for now, maybe, yeah. Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just again wanted to thank you and go. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I leave as always inspired and just filled with gratitude for what we have together. And I trust that those that we've invited into our conversation will also take the same inspiration from it. I look forward to future recordings where we capture. Some of them are going to be long, some of them are going to be short. Just capturing these moments that we get to share. Thank you, Sarika.
Thanks so much, Rensha.